Well, good morning and welcome to another beautiful Anzac Day in Adelaide as we commemorate the sacrifice of those who have served in the country's Defence Forces. I'm Neil Cross, alongside me is my ABC colleague Emma Rebellato and of course the RSL's Ambassador Bill Denny. Well, Emma, each year there are milestones, significant milestones in the Anzac story. Of course, it's 109 years since the landings at Gallipoli, but there are many other milestones that we acknowledge today.
Absolutely, and just a couple of them. So it's 70 years since the last Australian troops left Korea. It's also the 25th anniversary of Interfet, the Australian-led peacekeeping mission in Timor-Leste. But of course, so much of our focus is on World War II. And Bill, we are seeing, sadly, fewer veterans, of course, march this year.
Yes, Emma, sadly it's been a difficult year for the World War II veteran community. We've lost a large number. None more prominent, I have to say, than our much-loved Keith Chook Fowler, who died last November at 103. And there will only be, in fact, today, of the 54,000 that enlisted from South Australia for World War II, we'll probably only have 20 to 25 physically involved in the march. But we will remember all of them, and we will remember all those that have served their nation and passed on since that time.
Well, Bill, stay with us and stay with us wherever you're watching, because we'll be live with the march in about half an hour. You won't miss any of that. Right now, though, we're going to the start of Anzac Day, of course, the dawn service from the National War Memorial on North Terrace, and our coverage begins with the arrival of the Governor's Deputy, His Excellency Dr. Richard Harris.
Namani, Nainari Ian Smith, Mani Nabudni. Good morning, Your Excellency and Mrs. Harris, and everyone here, or listening, or watching, wherever you are in the state. My name is Ian Smith. On behalf of the State President of the Returned and Services League, Mr. Dave Peterson, I welcome you to this dawn service. We are very pleased so many have joined us here this morning. Nadlu Tampinthi, Nadlu Ghana, Yatanga Imparinthi. The RSL acknowledges that this memorial is built on the traditional lands of the Ghana people and pays respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. We pay our respects to the first peoples of these lands, both past and present, and especially to the thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have served this country in uniform despite the discrimination they have faced and the obstacles that have been placed in their way. Kia ora to our New Zealand comrades, represented here by Major Jean Fenton of the Ngāti Tumatauanga, the New Zealand Army, and Hoş geldiniz to the people of Turkey, represented by Ms. Tanya Kaplan from the Turkish Association of South Australia. And a special welcome to Mr Chris Tilley, who is the guest of the RSL this morning as a veteran of operations in East Timor. 100 years ago today, commemorative services and ceremonies were held marking the 9th anniversary of the Gallipoli landing. In Adelaide in 1924, a march was held and a service was conducted at the Cross of Sacrifice in Pennington Gardens because the striking memorial around which we are gathered today was not completed until 1931. 120 years ago, the impressive South African War Memorial outside the Government House gate was unveiled as the first of our state memorials. The names of the 60 men who enlisted in South Australian contingents and died as a result of their honourable service in that war are inscribed on its sides. From a population of less than 5 million, 331,000 Australians served overseas in the First World War, which began in 1914, and 60,000 remain buried in foreign soil. 156,000 were wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. No community across this state could have been left untouched by the scale of that loss. Few families were. The grief felt right across the country resulted in generational trauma that is still felt today. For years afterwards, funeral processions snaked out of the hospital at Keswick Barracks to the Australian Imperial Force Cemetery at West Terrace, carrying those who had finally succumbed to their wounds. This year marks the 80th anniversary of several Second World War battles against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. 1944 saw large campaigns to dislodge the Japanese from areas to our immediate north, including the Finisterre Rangers campaign, New Britain campaign and Huon Peninsula campaigns in New Guinea, the D-Day landings in France in June, which thousands of Australian sailors and aviators took part, and the liberation of the Philippines, where Australian ships were among the first to be subjected to kamikaze attacks by Japanese aircraft. 75 years ago today, the Australian Air Force concluded its important part in the Berlin airlift, which supplied the people of West Berlin with food and other necessities in the face of a ground blockade by the Soviet Union. 70 years ago, Australians were still serving in Korea after the armistice was signed at the end of the 1950-53 war, with 16 dying in post-armistice ceasefire monitoring operations. Over 17,000 Australians served in Korea, 340 died, and another 1,200 were wounded. 65 years ago, the first National Service Scheme ended. Some of the South Australians who were called up in that scheme will be marching in today's commemorative march. 60 years ago, the collision off Jarvis Bay between HMAS Melbourne and HMAS Voyager took the lives of 82 sailors and left many others with lifelong physical and mental scars. And 1964 also saw the beginning of Australian involvement in combat during the Indonesian confrontation in which 23 Australians died. Today, we remember the service and sacrifice of all Australians who have served our nation in wars and conflicts since the Second Boer War. In the last resort, they are the ones we have relied upon to protect us, our way of life and our democratic freedoms. Like people all over the world, we too draw strength from our history. It is hard to go past the example of the prisoners of war of the Japanese for an inspiring example of enduring hardship and demonstrating resilience. Courage, daring and self-belief in the face of extreme danger is exemplified by the 10 South Australians who have been awarded the Victoria Cross and the 2 South Australians who have been awarded the George Cross. Those who charged up the beach at Gallipoli in the half-light of the 25th of April 1915 epitomised the high standards of shared honour and responsibility that we expect the members of our Defence Force to exhibit when faced with death and adversity. Today we also acknowledge our allies, those who have stood shoulder to shoulder with us in both world wars and in many conflicts and operations since, especially the people of New Zealand, with whom we share a special bond forged on the rocky hills of Gallipoli. Many veterans commemorating alone in Australia, New Zealand and across the world will be missing their mates. And finding Anzac Day hard. As we pause to remember and honour the fallen, we must also guard our Anzac traditions against the heedless nationalism sometimes promoted by those who do not understand what Anzac Day is about. We must also be wary of those who seek to misuse the service and sacrifice of our veterans to promote their own agendas. Such actions are unwelcome, and we must protect ourselves and our Anzac traditions from them. Likewise, Anzac Day has never been about the glorification of war or success in battle. After all, our Anzac traditions spring from a disaster that cost the lives of 8,700 Australians and maimed 3 times as many, yet failed to achieve its aims. Anzac Day has a single focus: the commemoration of Australian and New Zealand veterans who offered and often sacrificed their lives in our name. It is a time we acknowledge that we are commemorating a willingness to serve and sacrifice for our country and its people. This applies as much to our young people currently serving on peacekeeping, border protection and other operations as it did to those that served in the First World War. It is also the time we acknowledge that we have a duty as a society to support those who have lost loved ones to war and its aftermath, and as each death leaves a trail of human heartbreak. We also have a responsibility to embrace our wounded veterans of all conflicts, some of whom are only just coming to terms with how their service has altered the path of their lives and those of their families. Sadly, this process can result in family breakdown and homelessness, and has seen hundreds of our veterans take their own lives. So today we commemorate, we show respect, we honour and we give thanks. We remember the 103,000 young Australians who lost their lives defending our land, people and democratic way of life, and remind ourselves to show compassion to those who have emerged from their service bearing physical, mental, spiritual or emotional scars. And finally, we remind those that we elect to represent us that they bear a great responsibility when they decide to send our young people to fight on our behalf, a responsibility that includes ensuring they are treated with respect and cared for properly when they return home. I now introduce Chaplain Paul Ganham, who will lead us through the service.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The term digger became popular in the trenches during World War I. Military slang originally for infantry soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, it now proudly embraces anyone who has sought to defend this nation as a member of the Australian Defence Force. On land, the air and sea, the ADF has been served by aviators, by sappers, by sailors, by signallers, by gunners, by combat medics, the cavalry, the military police, musicians, clerks, chefs, and even chaplains too. So many givers, all giving with the one purpose, the one mission. The variety of our God-given gifts put at the service of others is what we read about in St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 4 to 7. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. And so we pray, God of hope, As dawn breaks, we bring our thanks for the peace and the security we enjoy. We remember all Australians and New Zealanders who have served and continue to serve in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. This year, we remember those who served with Interfet. We remember the more than 5,500 servicemen and women who were sent to Timor-Leste, our nation's largest deployment since Vietnam, and the 5 Australian Defence Force personnel and the 1 Australian Federal Police member who gave up their life, paid the supreme sacrifice, including from the ADF, Russell Eisenhuth, Ashley Baker, Andrew Emerton, Stuart Jones, Beau Prideaux, and Sergeant Ben Kinlock from the Australian Federal Police. Make us good stewards of the freedom they won. We remember those of other nations who fought beside them and those who fought against them for their own countries. We remember the physically wounded and the mentally scarred. We pray for healing and peace for body, for mind, and spirit. We remember those who died in battle or from their wounds, and those who took their own lives in agony or despair. May we be healers of wounds unseen. We remember the prisoners of war and those who sheltered and sustained them. We remember the mothers, fathers, partners, sisters, children, and sweethearts who prayed and grieved for the missing and the lost. We pray for the comfort of all those who continue to mourn. We remember the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who fought for a nation that did not even recognise them as citizens. Continue leading us towards true reconciliation with Australia's First Peoples. Have mercy on those nations where war still rages, and keep safe our servicemen and women currently on deployment, away from family and friends. May the terrible cost of every other war ever fought renew us in our longing for peace and the will to work for it day by day and side by side. May the God of our understanding give life eternal to those diggers who have paid the ultimate price in war and in peace in the defence of Australia. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite our senior guests to place a wreath or tribute on the memorial. The first wreath and tribute will be placed by His Excellency the Governor's Deputy and Mrs. Harris. Mr Dave Peterson, State President of the Return and Services League, Major Jean Fenton, representing the New Zealand High Commissioner, Ms Tanya Kaplan, representing the Turkish Association of South Australia, and Mr Chris Tilley, representing those who served in East Timor. Honourable Peter Malinauskas, MP, Premier of South Australia. Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, the Acting Prime Minister. Senior ex-service and kindred organisations are now invited to place a wreath or tribute. The Naval Association of Australia, South Australian Section, the Royal Australian Regiment Association, South Australia, the Air Force Association, South Australian Division, the Legacy Club of Adelaide, and Australian War Widows. The Honourable Chris Kourakis, the Chief Justice of South Australia. The Honourable John Gardner, MP representing the State Leader of the Opposition. The Honourable Joe Sockarch, Minister for Veterans Affairs. Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, representing the Federal Leader of the Opposition. The Right Honourable Dr. Jane Lomax-Smith, the Lord Mayor of Adelaide. Steve Georgianis, MP, the Federal Member for Adelaide.
For those of you with a program in hand, I invite you to open it and to maybe share with your neighbour as we join in singing the hymn, Recessional.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Mr Chris Tilley to recite the Ode of Remembrance. Chris served in the Regular Army as an infantry soldier from 2004 to 2012 in the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and the Australian Federation Guard, and was awarded the Soldier's Medallion for exemplary service. He served with the International Stabilisation Force in Timor-Leste in 2006 and again the following year, and deployed to Afghanistan in 2008. After leaving the Army, Chris joined the Department for Correctional Services, where as the Senior Advisor for Veteran Services, he has established a veteran-centric strategy to rehabilitate veterans who have entered the state corrections system. After the ode, you are requested to remove non-military headdress and stand fast while the last post is sounded. The last post will be followed by 2-minute silence and the sounding of Reveille.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
A benediction is a fancy word for a concluding prayer, but it is a concluding prayer that sends us forth in pride and hope, resilient and strong. And so I invite you now to stand tall and proud as I give the benediction. Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold to that which is good. Render to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honour all people. Love and serve the Lord of your understanding by being of service to one another. And rejoice in God's Spirit. And may the blessing of God Almighty be with you and remain with you always. Amen.
We will now sing the national anthems of New Zealand and Australia. The words are in your service sheet.
So welcome to our coverage of the march after the dawn service this morning. This is the second part of the trilogy that's involved in this day. And of course the march is, if you like, I think, Bill Denny, it'd be the centre point for many people, isn't it?
It is very much, Neil. This is the part of the day that everybody comes out to observe and thank all the veterans that have served the nation.
And you can see many people here along King William Road are waiting for those war veterans to come past to thank them for their service. What is a fairly chilly day in Adelaide, I have to say, but it's great to see so many people here. And as you can see there, we have the South Australian Mounted Police, traditionally the head of the march, and not just the march, but in almost all major ceremonial activities here in South Australia. There you go.
Reviewing the march today, we have His Excellency Dr. Richard Harris, SC OAM, the Governor's Deputy, accompanied by Mrs. Fiona Harris. Dr. Harris is representing the Governor, our Governor, the Honourable Francis Adamson, AC, who's overseas on government business. His Excellency was appointed Lieutenant Governor on the 9th of February this year. He rose to global prominence following his involvement in the rescue of 12 children trapped in a cave in Thailand in 2018, and we all remember that. Like nearly every Australian, His Excellency has a military link, and his military link is through his uncle David, who served on HMAS Shropshire during World War II, and Shropshire was in the Pacific Theatre where it was involved in the Battle of Luzon. Also on the stand today is the newly appointed Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Joe Sockards. The Minister has a good pedigree itself, mainly through an in-law who was in Bomber Command. And I should also add Mr. Rod Bunton, the Governor's husband. Whilst Her Excellency is away, Mr. Bunton is here, and we remember from last year his father served in Bomber Command. So pretty well every Australian will, if they look into their history, find they have an ancestor who served.
And what we'll be seeing throughout the march is that at certain points in the march, flags will be lowered. So all flags are lowered during the march when they pass the State War Memorial on North Terrace, then the South African War Memorial, and also then the Governor, or in this case, the Governor's Deputy, Dr. Richard Harris, on the saluting dais. So as you can see there, the police greys leading the march down King William.
In 1945, Emma, it's hard to believe, but 120,000 viewed this march, and 10,000 people marched, and they would have been entirely all returned veterans from the World War I and II.
And Bill, we mentioned the Governor's absence. I believe you got a call from the Governor, is that right?
Her Excellency was assiduous in making sure that everybody knew that she loves being here, and she sees it as a very important part of her job, but an important government obligation took her overseas, and we all understand that. And we know that she is very fond of the ex-service community and all people in South Australia.
So behind the Mounted Police, we also have the band of the South Australian Police, as well as the Returned and Services League banner. So while this morning many people attended the dawn service on North Terrace, as well as in dozens and dozens of locations right across the state, for many this vigil began much earlier. Before dawn service was the Anzac Youth Vigil. And here we go, we can see the Tiger Moths lead aircraft with Steve Jenkins and also Steve Johnson, owner pilot as well. His dad flew Lancasters with the RAF Bomber Command in World War II. And Steve Jenkins is an ex-RAF test pilot as well.
Going to have a series of flyovers during the morning, which when you go from ground to sky, looking around, trying to find them, we hear some noise at some stage, and we'll try to get you some pictures as we saw the Tiger Moths send. We'll have a boomerang later on, an Aerotech Black Hawk as well as we move through the morning. In the background, the band of the South Australia Police just going past where we are. You can hear that through the mics. So the New Zealand veterans, obviously the other part, Australia and New Zealand in Anzacs, and they lead off.
Guests of honour on this Anzac Day Also, we can see behind the New Zealand veterans, Turkey's. This includes members of the Turkish community, led by Berna Kardes, President of the Turkish Association of South Australia.
And who can forget the words of Ataturk, the Turkish leader in 1934, when he and his country embraced all the Australians killed at Gallipoli, trying to invade Turkey, by saying that having died in his country, they had become his sons as well. And that statement led to the forming of a really solid relationship between Turkey and Australia. Once enemies, now extremely firm friends.
We're getting now to the Boer War, World War I and legacy, but importantly, as we go through this, Bill, we're going to have you talk mostly because it's going to go so quickly, because obviously no veterans left from the World War I and these events. But as we get into World War II, they're thinning very fast. So we want to get as much information out from you and your personal details as much as possible.
Well, these banners, the closest thing you're going to find here in this part of the march is indeed under legacy, because legacy represents widows, and there are widows still alive who would have widows of World War I veterans who've passed. It's about as close as we'll get to World War I, other than these banners, which cause us to pause and remember everywhere that we served and all the different battles that our forces were involved in. We're getting on to legacy, and that this year's led by President Legatee Rob Ely, who is the gentleman with the silver hair below the blue banner. Rob served in the ADF in all three services for over 40 years. But the Legacy Club of South Australia in Broken Hill currently supports 2,707 beneficiaries and 108 youth, the youngest being 8 and the oldest 109. And there are 328 legatees that carry out that marvellous task. The two Legacy youth walking with Rob, they will place the wreath at the Cross of Sacrifice, are Oscar and Nathaniel Kemp. Straight on to World War II. That's how quick it is.
So
9 division,
85 years, that's how long, that's when Australia officially entered World War II, 3rd of September 1939, 85 years ago.
54,660 enlisted. And there I can see on the left-hand side with his hand up is our good friend Ron George. Ron is being pushed by his daughter Sonia. Ron was 99th. Will be 100 on the 10th of March next year. He was on the Westralia when it came under kamikaze attack. He's also coxswain of a landing craft in New Guinea and the Philippines. Hello to Sid West, who's marching in, who's watching from home at Mount Barker. Sid was sailed on the Hobart, and have to report we've lost dear George Lower, who marched here last year. He died at 102, and we send our condolences to his family. Here we got HMAS Warramunga. This is the destroyers, and there's Reg Swanborough marching, as I can see, in uniform.
Ah, yes.
Dear old Reg, looking good. In the last year, he's had a burst appendix. Spent 7 weeks in hospital and 4 months in rehab. Coming up 102, he's back on deck.
And look at him go.
At Swanee's irrepressible in the 70s, he rode his bike from Adelaide to Perth. He said he did it the hard way, into the wind. He served
there would be an easy way to do that, I'm sure.
getting in the slipstream with a semi-trailer, but he wouldn't have done that. Reg served on the Vindex and later transferred to the RAN. I'm not sure if Graham West was there, but he served on the Warramunga, and I think he was being wheeled by his son, Tony. Graham's just turned 98.
Okay, so now we've got the Corvettes, followed by HMA Fairmiles as well.
Corvettes were small ships designed for escort duties, and I can see Roy Mingy is marching there on the right. On the left is Roy. That's Roy. Roy is marching as usual. He's one of our youngest marchers. He's not a bad effort. 98. Good on you, Roy. He joined Bathurst in Bombay in 1944, age 17, and he went on to serve in the Maryborough and the Cessnock. But Roy marches in his own right, but also in memory of his brother Ron, who was in the 2nd 6th Commando Regiment. Ray Desmond marched last year with daughter Linda. I'm not sure if he's there this year. Then we get to 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, and we've lost dear Chook Fowler from last year, and this year we've got the family representing the members of the 2nd, 3rd. This will be the last time that unit is parades before it's retired. Having no more marches, they march for what the units are paraded for 1 year before they then the unit is retired. Descendants can still march, and they march in a different part of the march itself. There we saw Glenn Weir, the son of Hugh Weir, Robert Fowler, Chook's son, and his grandson Scott McAvoy, Rod Hearn, the son of Peter, Jack Howie, son of Jim, and Andrew Thomas, the son of Jack Thomas, who's the second last member of the unit.
This is the Adelaide Highland and Adelaide Irish pipe bands playing an important role in keeping the pace on this march on this Anzac Day here in Adelaide 2024. So behind the band we can see the interstate units. So this Interstate Unit Association was formed in 1955 for SA-based ex-servicemen who served in interstate units in Australia but also overseas.
Colin Murray's there, that's Colin Murray. He's marching today, being wheeled by his son Gary. Colin will be 101 next Boxing Day, served in 1 armoured division and went to Singapore at the end of the war to help repatriate prisoners of war. Then behind Colin, we've got Laurie Gillespie. Laurie is a good friend of mine, his son being wheeled by his grandson Nick. Laurie served in Darwin, Port Moresby and Lae and rose to the rank of sergeant. He'll hit the century, Laurie actually hit the century in December, and I know the family will put on a great show to mark his milestone.
And here we have one of our incredible vehicles. The Military Vehicles Preservation Society of South Australia has a lot of vehicles that mean lots of people can take part.
And in that vehicle at the moment is Di Watson, 58 Searchlight battery, and Di's the last surviving member of that unit, so it's lovely to see her out and about. The Australian Women's Land Army, they did a marvellous job, formed in July 42 to take over rural production and release men for service. I know that Reen Dixon is listening to this march from Port Elliot, and we send her our best. She turned 101 last year.
Yeah, at its peak in December of 1943 with the Australian Women's Land Army, more than 2,300 there were permanent members and more than 1,000 auxiliary members as well, playing a very important role. And there we can see the Women's Auxiliary for the Air Force.
And there you've got regular marchers, Ray Harris and June Hunter. Ray served in signals, intercepting enemy transmissions, and June was a driver at Lake Bulga Flying Port Base in Victoria. Both Ray and June are about to celebrate their 99th birthday. Should mention here our beloved Thelma Zimmerman, aka Queen Thelma. We lost Thelma a year or two ago, but she marched regularly and we loved her dearly.
We zip straight through to the Royal Australian Air Force from World War II. And a lot of these obviously just signs and just banners these days.
I think Lyle Ellis just went past. Lyle is 100 years old. He was a flight lieutenant, did 2 tours in New Guinea. And now we have in signals and radar, I'm looking for Robert Rankin, who should have been, we're thinking is marching today, being wheeled by his daughter, Megan. Like all those young, he joined at 16, like a lot of the young fellows did in those days. Robert served as a wireless air gunner.
And we have Angus in the Rolls-Royce, I do believe.
Have to be Angus in his Rolls-Royce, dear old Angus Hughes, who is just turned 100 as a veteran of Bomber Command, the last surviving member of, last surviving prisoner of war in South Australia, a prisoner of war of the Germans. I think it was his, had to parachute out of his aircraft at night. The aircraft crashed and he was captured and spent the last remaining months of the war in captivity.
And we'll be hearing more about Angus a bit later in the program. We sat down and spoke with him as well, so we'll bring that to you later.
Now we're up to the third group, and that is the Korea, Malaya, Borneo and Navy Vietnam veterans. So as we said, it slips through very quickly.
It does.
Those World War I, World War II, already we're talking about Korea.
Yes, 18,000 Australians served in the Korean War between 50 and 53. One of the most prominent units was 77 Squadron, respected and loved South Australian. Bob McIntosh flew with 77 Squadron, and much loved Dr. Don Beard served in Korea. We also remember the loss of Rocky Enoch, who was a loved veteran in South Australia who died only last month. Rocky served in Korea with 1 battalion and was at the Battle of Kapyong and Mariang San. Malaya and Borneo, Don Cameron's leading that group. We remember Captain Aileen Ryan, who served in Malaya and passed recently. We also remember Brian Selby, who was the previous president.
Here, but you can't see yet. Another one of those flyovers. I believe that might have been the Boomerang. That was flying past, as is the March.
And how wonderful is it to see so many people lining the streets here, applauding and thanking all these men and women for their service.
There we are, Her Majesty's, Her Majesty's Fleet Air Arm. I can see Henry Young there on the left-hand side, in the blue tie and the grey suit. Henry's has the distinction of serving in the Army, Navy and Air Force during his career from 1943. He's in his 101st year. He's a champion Masters tennis player, just returned from Turkey, where he competed in the doubles and singles International Tennis Federation Masters World Championship. So congratulations, Henry. Great job, both at war and afterwards, and still going. Far East Strategic Reserve are going past. They formed in 55 and finished up in 1971, led today by Maury Davey. 26 ships and 5,000 sailors served in the Far East Strategic Reserve, providing close support to RAN operations. Moving straight on to RAN Vietnam.
Just a note here that the HMAS Sydney carried 16,000 troops to Vietnam, was nicknamed the Vung Tau Ferry. The last troop movement on Sydney returned in March 1972.
It did. Now you've got the RAN gunline destroyers.
So that included the ships Hobart, Perth, Brisbane and Vendetta, known as the gunline destroyers.
And followed by the clearance divers. These men are the equivalent to what the younger viewers will see on TV are the American SEALs. These are underwater divers, clearance divers. They've served in pretty well every conflict. Very, very brave men, highly trained and courageous.
And by great job. I mean, disposal and demolition of sea mines, the clearance of obstacles, underwater battle damage repair, and clandestine placing of charges and demolitions. That's not scary at all.
And called out whenever there's Warwick Raymond. He's a Malaya veteran in that vehicle there. See Warwick. And also in this next vehicle, I think, will be Peter England and Bob McIntosh. Yes, they're also, those clearance divers are also used in civilian capacity when an aircraft goes down. Jarvis Bay, one went down, I think, late last year, and they're called out to do that sort of work all the time. So it's whenever needed. So, yeah, it's a very difficult job.
So now we're up to Army veterans of Vietnam.
Yep. And I like to add here that, you know, many Australians still query the political justification of the Vietnam War, but that said, every Australian can be immensely proud of how our men and women acquitted themselves in the conflict, particularly when you realise you've got a lot of national servicemen who are co-opted to be there. And from to this very day, you'll find that our former enemy respect us as a good and fair enemy. Our friends, the South Vietnamese, still love us. So whilst it was a difficult war, I'm confident that every Australian acquitted himself quite magnificently, and there are no skeletons in our closet there, I can tell you.
Well, and many made the ultimate sacrifice too. 58 South Australians were killed in action there.
Yes. We've got the training team group that's there, the Australian Army training team, and hello to Brigadier Pat Beale, DSOMC of up in the hills, Tony Mogridge, Snow Chester and Vic Pennington. That's Tony Mogridge in that vehicle there. The 30 advisors started off in Vietnam in '62, and they were there for 10 years. Very highly decorated unit.
So we also have the Royal Australian Armoured Corps. So you can see there the flags are lowered in the front rank, and that's to honour the 5 South Australians from 3rd Cavalry Regiment who were killed in action in South Vietnam. A really important tribute.
Cheerio to Craig Mitchell, who normally marches, is not marching today. He was did 2 years in Vietnam as a national serviceman, and was wounded and had a pretty tough time of it.
And this is the City of Adelaide Pipe Band. Bill, you talked about politically how the Vietnam War was a very challenging and contentious decision for Australia to take part in that. And as a consequence for so many of our veterans who returned from Vietnam, they've got a mixed reception, shall we say, to the very least.
They did. It was sad.
Yeah, and very difficult for them to get over that, I think, for some of them too.
Yeah, some of them struggle with it. I think a lot of them have made reconciled with their country and the people that were against them. After all, they're only doing what their government demanded. So if anybody was to be held accountable, it was to be the politicians. There we have the Royal Australian Artillery, and being led by John Derbyshire with the striking grey hair. John served with 107 Battery in 70-71. And there he is, that's John Derbyshire. John went on to become the commanding officer of 16 Air Defence Regiment in the Hills. And many will know him because he had a distinguished career later on with the MFS Scouts SA, Australian Protective Service. Another prominent veteran there is Adrian Walford, who is marching, well known in his work with veterans in Murray Bridge. And we've got engineers. We should point out the engineers. They did a marvellous job over there, including mine clearing, booby trap, disposal construction, and cheerio to Roger Cook, who's marching there in the chair. There he is. Good old Roger. He's a great man, a former Wallaby. But in Vietnam, there he is. He was responsible for building the main highway through Phuoc Tuy province. And I understand the communist government is still very grateful because it's a bit like Anzac Highway. It's still going and they love it. 50 years later, Roger said he was completely secure in Vietnam because they knew he was building a road for them. So no one wanted to have a go at him.
Just leave him go.
Yeah.
Now we can also see here the tunnel rats. Now we know what an extremely difficult job they had in Vietnam.
Tony Parmenter was a tunnel rat, a Cookera Warringoo man, a friend of mine, one of the many Aboriginal soldiers that distinguished themselves. I'd like at this time also to mention Terry Zaya, an engineer, very close friend of mine, dear man, one of the best blokes I've met in the military. Passed a couple of years ago, but I always like to give him he and his family a shout out. Great bloke.
Should be said that tunnel rats casualties are very high, so 33% was the casualty rate for them. 1 in 3 of these men were killed or wounded during their tour, so fantastic to see some of them still out and about.
Crawl down a tunnel with just a pistol and a torch, not knowing what's around the corner. Royal Australian Corps of Signals, who provided all the communications between Australia and Vietnam and monitored enemy transmissions.
Okay, now we have our Army Veterans Vietnam with the Australian Intelligence Corps. And the Australian Intelligence Corps has served in all major and minor conflicts since being formed back in December of 1907.
There we have the RAASC being led by Jim McGowan. That's a combined group of RAASC and I think 86 Transport Platoon following them up. But Jim served with over in Vietnam in 70-71. See John Cambridge there on the left with all those medals. John is I think the 4th generation of his family to serve. There's 86, a great unit, but...
Why is that a great unit, Bill?
That's my unit. Unfortunately, our numbers have dwindled, and I need to send a really big shout out to probably one of our most hard-working members, a fellow called Bill Hignett, OAM, who's watching from home. Bill was a national serviceman I had the privilege of working with. He rendered great service in Vietnam and afterwards, but he's not well at the moment. But he is universally respected and is the lifeblood of our association.
And your platoon was known as the Galloping Greengrocers, Bill.
We were. Sadly, we've lost quite a few members recently, among them Gary Wolford, John Jebb, Trevor Nugget Wayland, Mick Hicks, and most recently, just a few months ago, Gary Zabersky, and our best to Judy.
So as we'll be seeing right throughout the march, and you probably would have noticed already if you're watching at home, you'll see some people wearing medals on their left, but also on their right. So wearing on their left means they have served and were awarded these medals for their service. If they're also wearing medals on their right, those who are taking part in the march, that means a relative has served and they are wearing those medals in honour of them, and they are marching to thank them for their service as well.
Under the pipes and drums of the Royal Caledonian Society of South Australia, and then on to the, as we said, the 1st Australian Field Hospital in Vietnam.
And their unit motive was the bat or vampire. They were known for their call for blood donations. When people would cry out, the vampires are looking for blood, playing a very important role in treating casualties and the injured in Vietnam.
They must have been hugely successful at getting the blood, I'd reckon, because 99% success rate for patients who reached the facility.
I can see Titch Tyson leading that group, the 1st Australian Field Hospital. Titch marches every year. He does a great job in supporting the veterans community. Titch with his black beret on there. There he is.
In there. Yep.
Does a great job. He's lives and breathes the veterans community, that man. The 2nd Field Ambulance was the first Army Medical Corps unit to be deployed to Vietnam. And then 8 Field came after the 2nd. You've got 8 Field there today. We sent a cheerio to Brigadier Robert Atkinson, who normally marches but's laid up in Flinders today, getting better. I think you can see Rod Murray there on the left-hand side with a nice stripy tie. Rod was a medic in Vietnam.
We also have Ramey there, the Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. So they pretty much fixed everything. Vehicles, tanks, weapons, equipment. You name it, they did it.
That's right. We have the Land Rover 86 Transport Platoon, the boys that with Dean Ryan and Dave Limpers, former members of that unit. And then the marvellous, the RSL Care Bus. And this is from the War Veterans Home at Myrtle Bank, and there is no finer organisation. Brilliantly led, brilliantly managed. I've told my wife I don't care what she does, but when I need to go into care, she's got to sell everything so I can get up there. And she's already started it. She's having garage sales. But we've got John Lees in there, Val Lawrence, Roger Halliday, Lennox Pawson, Fivros Marco and Jack Gibson, who is the coordinator and holds it all together. There's the RSL Care Bus waving. And we'll wave back to them. Now we have, after this bus, the Vietnam and other the Vietnam veterans organisations. You know, there's a number of those, but they club together on this day to in solidarity, but they're all of these men are Vietnam veterans. See Phil Scroop carrying the flag there. Phil from the Vietnam Veterans Federation, prominent contributor down Clarendon Way. Bob Shahinga might have been there. Bob was a Navy man. He's the president of the Vietnam Veterans Association. Then we run straight into the CMF Observers Vietnam. These were members of the Army Reserve Forces, the CMF of the time, who went across to Vietnam and observed. Brigadier Ellis Oscar Whalen's a regular marcher, and also like to mention Lieutenant Colonel Rod Ferrier, who used to march. He was in the Army Corps, did a couple of tours there.
Yeah, some 700 officers participated in the observers, including 42 South Australians.
Right. We have the Air Force Association, led by its president Lawrence NG, and also Group Captain Robert Black, who is a prominent veteran from South Australia and did a lot of good work. Straight on to RAAF Vietnam, and that's Norm Goodall's there. Norm commanded 9th Squadron in Vietnam and flew bushranger gunships over there. The RAAF began their involvement in 1964 and served the entire time through.
So another prominent milestone, 60 years.
We always like to mention Michael Herbert of North Glenelg, who flew Canberra bombers and was lost with 2 Squadron in Vietnam, and he was killed in 1970 and remained lost for nearly 40 years. And we didn't forget him, nor did his family, and we sent our best to his brother Shane. We finally found him in the end, and through the good work of a bloke called Jim Burke.
And we also have Royal Australian Air Force, Ubon. So between 1965 and 68, personnel of number 79 Squadron and Base Squadron were stationed at Ubon in northeast Thailand to support the local Air Force and also the US Air Force units who were operating over Vietnam. We now have HMA submarines. They conducted surveillance missions and covert operations in waters of Southeast Asia.
Then comes after the submarines comes the entertainment groups. So there's some familiar faces there. Oops, there's a fly past.
Okay.
A Black Hawk, I think.
This is a Aerotech Black Hawk, formerly a US Black Hawk, but it's now been converted for aerial firefighting. Can carry 4,000 litres of water, mostly in the Adelaide Hills during fire season. And the Australian Army also employed the Black Hawk helicopter since 1987.
And there's Johnny Mack and Bev Harrell. They are part of the Australian Entertainment Groups Vietnam. And Ann Wills was part of that. They entertained the groups and they march in this group, as they are today, which is lovely. Johnny Mack's doing well, isn't he? Still smiling?
Yes, and really they played a really important role, didn't they? Just offered a small reprieve from the hardship of war.
They did, yeah.
It's another world, isn't it? It's just to think, you know, just a couple of entertainers and the difference they make to the troops.
Absolutely. Oh, there's the Vietnamese community, and they're a really good group of people. Leading that group today is the President Dang Thao Nguyen, a friend of mine. He served for 6 years in the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, and also marching as Lung Tran and Lee Vai. Lung was a Marine who served on the North-South Vietnam border, and Lee Van Lay was an officer in the Republic of Vietnam Army. These men, after Saigon fell, were all imprisoned in re-education camps, called them prisoner of war camps, until they got away on leaky boats and came to make Australia their new home. And I've got to tell you, they've made a marvellous contribution to Australia. We're lucky to have them here. Now we get on to the RAR group, led by Rod Graham today. He's the Vice President of the RAR Association, served in 6 RAR and 66, 67 as a rifleman.
Start to get some really healthy numbers now.
Yes, they're surviving. Here's 1st Battalion being led by John Genovese, and the 2nd Battalion, they're going through very, very quickly. Scott Jeffrey. That's John Mathwin on there with the drum there, on the wheel, in his wheelchair, carrying the side drum. John served in Vietnam between 67 and 68. They'd be lost without him, those infantrymen. They can't march. So They might not like me saying that. 3 RAR, being led by Ray Shillabeer, platoon commander in A Company in Vietnam 71. Normally, Colonel Peter Scott had been with this group. Peter served in Korea as a platoon commander and then led this unit in Vietnam. I want to mention prominent Kangaroo Island resident, former National Serviceman Dave Manser, MM. He was a corporal in 3 RAR at the Battle of Coral Balmoral and was awarded the Military Medal. But I've read his citation, and some of my friends believe it should have been a Victoria Cross, not a military medal, but he's a great man, Dave. Going right through 4 Battalion. Mick Woosman leading. Graham Spingston served there, a good well-known South Australia 5th Battalion.
Yeah, you can see the prominent tiger's head
Just
on
stands
the
out,
5th
doesn't it?
Battalion. It certainly does.
Yeah.
And 5 RAR contingent led by Rod Gaskin, who served in Vietnam in 1967 and 1970.
6 RAR did 2 tours in Vietnam, including the one that's better known being the one that in the Battle of Long Tan in 18th of August 66. William Wallace is leading that unit. He was a platoon commander at the time. Mick Storen, prominent South Australian. The subject, I was only 19. The song, I was only 19, written by his brother-in-law, served in that unit. I don't know whether Mick's marching or not today.
Okay, that's 7th Battalion.
Chris Ashenden leading that. He was the founding president of their association. I don't know whether Graham Corns is marching. He's sometimes in that unit.
Yeah, he certainly does. So 2 tours of Vietnam. The first in 67, 68, and then in 1970, 71.
At RAR, established in Anoka in 1966. Not many South Australians served in it. See today that Dennis Broadbent is leading it today. He served with B Company 8 RAR, and his boss was Major Michael Jeffrey, who later became Governor General. So 9 RAR, the flags of the representing the deceased members of the of that unit. Jeff Betch is leading that unit.
He was a machine gunner.
He was.
Yeah, and also known for his successes in the Sydney to Hobart yacht race.
That's right, talented man. 2nd, 4th Battalion. They were linked in 1973 to form the 2nd, 4th, but delinked to individual battalions in 1995 with 2 RAR located at Townsville and 4 RAR become a commando battalion in Sydney.
See 5th, 7th Battalion there. Again, linked in 1973, de-linked in 2006.
Now we have the Australian Special Air Service Association of South Australia, established in 1957, and then 60 years ago, the SAS gained regimental status and was expanded as well.
Steve McGuinness was their vice president, served with 2 squadron in Vietnam. The Land Rover here, I think that's Gary White from who served with 3 RAR, if I'm not mistaken. Now we get to our recent conflicts and peacekeepers, starting with Kuwait, and 1,800 ADF members from all 3 services were deployed to Kuwait in response to Iraq's 1990 invasion, and we were there from 90 to 91. And we remember Guy Bowring, who served with the RAAF in Kuwait and has left his legacy through the Veterans Health Precinct at Door Park.
Of course, known as the first Gulf War Desert Storm.
Leading Somalia groups, John O'Grady. Now that man with the blue beret there, he's coming up for 50 years in uniform later this year. Extraordinary. He's been in the army for 50 years. That's a great work, and he served in Somalia. Congratulations, John.
So next up we have our peacekeepers and multinational force and observers.
I'd like to acknowledge a fellow who doesn't march, but a fellow called Locke Mitchell. He had a very impressive RAAF career. He would be with this group. He served in Cambodia, served with the RAAF for over 44 years. And rose to the rank of group captain, well known to many people in South Australia.
And after the Onka Paringa Pipe Band and the Mount Barker Caledonian Society Pipes and Drums, we get to the Interfet, the East Timor or Timor-Leste.
So 25 years ago, the Interfet was deployed, led by Australia, to put Timor-Leste on its path towards independence, and created a really strong bond between Australia and Timor-Leste, which in fact was created before that, but certainly solidified during that period of time.
Now we have our Afghanistan veterans. That war began for us in 2001 with a small force of SAS entering Afghanistan, but more than 20,000 Australian military personnel served over a 13-year period. We lost 41 soldiers killed and 362 wounded, with 4 Victoria Crosses awarded.
Yeah, it only officially came to end 13 years later in December 2014.
Yeah. We move on to Iraq. With our contribution being Operation Falconer, which took place in 2003, and then Operation Catalyst.
And Australia was also involved in the UN assistance mission for Iraq from 2009 to 2013. So that started 15 years ago. So initially that consisted of 2 military observers and 1 defence civilian, playing a really important role there.
Bougainville is Operation Belisi meaning peace agreement or consensus, which is a dispute in which Australia helped resolve in '89. We sent between 4th and the 24th and 21st of October 1994, 648 personnel served in the Australian-led South Pacific Peacekeeping Force.
We can also see Solomon Islands. Australia led an international regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands in 2003 as a result of domestic unrest there.
Border protection operations. Border Protection Command was established in 2005 by the Australian Federal Police, and they do law enforcement at sea.
And members of the Army Reserve units based in South Australia have deployed on these operations too, as have surveillance aircraft from RAAF Edinburgh.
Blue banner of the police peacekeepers. This group represents civilian police from all states in Australia, including federal police and the others who've served with UN peacekeeping forces. Police officers have represented the United Nations in Cyprus from 1964 until 2017, with approximately 1,600 serving during that time.
Next up, we have our returned and non-returned former and serving personnel.
There's the National Servicemen. Padre Rod Denton is leading that group. There's Joe Dennis holding the banner there.
So there were 2 national service schemes in Australia from 1951 to 1959, and then again later from 65 to 72.
So that's the draft.
That's a draft, 2 years.
It's a different kind of draft, isn't it?
Well, look, I'll talk about it a bit later, but, you know, 2 years they were called up for, a year to train, and then after 12 months training, thrown into a war. And, you know, the amount of work they did in that 12 months to get up to speed was quite amazing. And the men that did go overseas and fight, in fact, all of them, turned out to be exceptionally good soldiers.
So 202 were killed during their service, including 58 from South Australia.
Exactly, in Vietnam. They were conscripted for Vietnam because we didn't have enough regular troops to prosecute that conflict.
We can see here the Australian Defence Force Health Services, formerly known as the Australian Army Medical Services, formed more than 100 years ago. So we can see a mix of full-time and part-time personnel.
There's Lee Francis as the right marker, with a great contributor to the ex-service community. That group's led by Vicky Anderson's AM, which the first female CO commanding officer to deploy a unit overseas in World War II. See, Lorraine Masters was there on him, come down from Loxton to join us for the day. She was in the nursing corps, 64, 65. the Royal Australian Navy, former members.
HMAS Adelaide here. Members represent crews from both HMAS Adelaide 1 and HMAS Adelaide 2.
HMAS Encounter, which was the shore base for the Port Adelaide Division of the Royal Australian Navy Reserve. It was called HMAS Torrens until HMAS Encounter was established in 1965, and it was based at Birkenhead. Then we have HMAS Lewin or Tingara. This includes members of the Royal Australian Navy who served under the name Tingara at any stage in their career. Training bases included HMAS Tingara, HMAS Lewin and HMAS Cerberus. And that word Tingara is an Aboriginal word for open sea.
And we can see coming up here our transport vehicles again playing a really important role in this Anzac Day march, making sure our veterans who aren't able to walk, because it is quite a length, especially when the sun's out,
it is, that
they can still take part in this and to be thanked for their service as well. And you can see there a lot of people waving and applauding. The applause have not stopped since the march began.
While we do that too, we should thank the Australian Navy, Army and Air Force cadets and the Australian Air League, because along with the guides and scouts, they're the ones carrying the unit identification signs during the march. So now we're up to Group 11, so the returned and non-returned former and serving personnel. Starting off there with the former members of the Australian Army. Includes all former members of the Army that are not marching in other units.
And then beyond that, you can see the Women's Royal Australian Army Corps, or RAC, with their very distinctive green blazers on.
Led by Cheryl Cates there at the front. She, former president of the RSL, did a great job for some years and finished up last year, but we actually left the RSL in a far better condition than she found it, so that was great. There's Maria Barclay there. Her husband, sadly, an infantryman, platoon commander in Vietnam, sadly died not long ago, and Maria carries his legacy and does a marvellous job. Here's the officer training unit at Skyville, and this is a training unit in a short 254 days that would take national servicemen that effectively come off the street and turn them into young officers, and then train them to the extent that they could go to Vietnam and command a group of 30 men in a platoon at war. And they did all of this in 254 days. And there were some marvellous young men. Bob Lewis of Laura, who was wounded in action, decorated. He was one of those graduates. John O'Connell, Craig Mitchell went into 3 Cavalry Regiment, and there are other men like Kevin Shoppy, who didn't see overseas service in Vietnam, but sadly lost his life in New Guinea. That organisation, to produce men of such, train men to that level in 6 months, is quite amazing.
We have the Air Defence Artillery there, providing protection to military assets from Army units in the field to a defensive role in the Royal Australian Navy, and as well as air defence to the Royal Australian Air Force.
So Australian Pipes and Drums leading on to the Royal Australian Engineers. So engineers providing mobility and counter-mobility capabilities to the Australian Army and its allies.
We now have the Royal Australian Engineers. And today the Engineers are being led by the President of the RAE Association in South Australia, Ken Daly.
Survey Corps no longer was disbanded. It was the corps that was responsible for all the maps, but now together with the advance in technology and satellite navigation, I don't think maps on paper are used as much. Signals consisting of regular and reservists responsible for field communications, electronic command and control and electronic warfare. That Royal South Australian Regiment, they represent the members of National Service from National Service, CMF, reserves and regular units have served with the 10th to 27th Battalion Royal South Australian Regiment and its many antecedent units.
And we now have another fly past, as you can see there on screen. One of several that we have throughout the march.
Straight down King William Street, straight down King William Road, and heading north.
There we go. Now the RACT coming up here, the Royal Australian Corps of Transport, and I can see these are the members of the Royal Australian Corps. I see Blue Wanacott, Rob Kenny, Beryl Rowe there, Beryl in the front rank, and we remembered their past members, Linda Mollendale, Woodhart. That corps celebrated its 50th anniversary recently. I'd like to give a shout out to my mate. He was actually a Vietnam veteran, Tony Dennis, who I walk my dog with each morning, but a great member of the Royal Australian Corps of Transport in 85 Transport Platoon.
Of the Royal Australian Army Ordnance Corps, consisting of both reservists and regular Army members, and it's been in existence since Federation.
Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, consisting of reservists and regular Army members, and that corps has a responsibility for the maintenance and recovery of all Army electrical and mechanical equipment. Catering Corps, they say the Army marches on its stomach, but there's nobody there today, so what does that mean?
I don't know.
Busy preparing for after the march.
They're doing the barbecue. But I shouldn't make light of it, because keeping the soldiers well fed is integral to having a good force in the field.
As is having them paid, as you can see, Royal Australian Army Pay Corps. So,
but the military police are here. What does that say?
Yes.
This consists of both reservists and regular Army members, and they're responsible for battlefield traffic control, security duties, prisoner of war handling, investigation of service offences and all sorts of things.
We also have here the Royal Australian Air Force former members. So this includes all former members of the Air Force not marching in other units. They can take part in this by marching in this group today.
we know, Bill, everything's organised both through the history, but also the order of march, which starts with the Army, Navy, then the Air Force.
Navy, Army,
that's
Air
right,
Force.
Army, Navy, Air Force. But this march in South Australia is recognised, I think, across Australia as the best organised march. Would you say that?
Well, we're told it is. Of course, we only see this one, so we say that.
I've seen some interstate ones, and I tell you, they don't go as timely as this.
I think Ian Smith and the team get a lot of reports that the march is a very, very good one. And here we have the Australian Defence Force. We've got the Royal Australian Navy Guard, then HMAS Encounter. Leading this today is Lieutenant Commander Gary Burns. And the HMAS Encounter is the Royal Australian Navy Headquarters unit, which was recommissioned in May 22 from the previous Navy Headquarters, South Australia.
And that's followed by HMAS Toowoomba, so the 7th of 8 Anzac class frigates of the Royal Australian Navy. And Toowoomba and her crew are currently in port visiting Adelaide.
Don't they look smart? Commander Barton Harrington RAN as the ship's captain.
And this gives you a bit of an idea of what the numbers would have looked like.
Yes, yes.
Many decades ago, when our men and women returned from service.
As you can see there, 1st Armoured Regiment, I think that is there, and right down King William Road now, you can see a long line of these uniforms, and that's what it would have been like years ago. You can see from that shot down the road, it would have been, they would have even marched, they wouldn't have marched, what are they marching?
That would have been 9 abreast,
yeah.
They would have been much wider abreast then. The numbers make it a shorter march for them because the numbers were so great. There's 1 Armoured Regiment being led by Lieutenant Colonel Jake Penley and the RSM, Grant Krispsky. That unit was formed in 1949 and was initially a part of the occupation force in Japan. All the squadrons of the regiment served, all 3 squadrons of the regiment served in Vietnam, and they were operating Centurion tanks at the time. That unit served in every conflict since Vietnam, including East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Just a reminder, isn't it, that we've still got many servicemen out there defending.
Absolutely, as
our
Ian
privileges.
Smith said today, you know, when his excellent summary in the dawn service this morning, we learned how many people.
Servicemen and servicewomen, of course, women performing part of every aspect of our defence forces these days. And I think that's really important to touch on as well, that so often when we think of those who have served and our war veterans, we often think of men, but women are taking such an extraordinary role these days.
Absolutely.
And have done for many years and many decades, as we even talked about back in World War II with the roles that women took to allow men to take service and fight.
Yes, underestimated then, but not by those that knew what was going on, and certainly not now, not today. Very much valued and provide extraordinary service. 7 RAR, this unit was formed in the 1st of September 65 for service in the Vietnam War, and it's been served in all conflicts, including East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan, and more recently supporting our nation with domestic operations. And leading it today is Lieutenant Colonel Levin Lambert and RSM Alan Ashman.
So this battalion relocated to Edinburgh in 2011, and then in October, a couple of years ago in 2022, 7 RAR came under command of 9th Brigade.
They all look so young.
we are so old. That's the story, isn't it? But yeah, it's the...
Well, is it fighting a war as a young man's business or a young woman's business? Very sad.
And I'd just like to touch on a lot of the current deployments and operations that Australia's Defence Force are involved in. So in the Middle East, there are 40 personnel with Operation Al-Ghuri at the moment. We've also got Operation Kudu in the United Kingdom. So we've got 90 Defence Force personnel there, and they're training, it's part of this commitment, training Ukrainian recruits as they fight the invasion of Russia in Ukraine.
Very highly regarded. While we've got a little gap, I'd like to just mention a World War II veteran that I didn't get a chance to mention when we went through the World War II group. Was our friend Colin Waggoner of Mount Barker. And Colin is our oldest veteran, or thought to be, at 106 years and 4 months, and a truly delightful man he is, fit and alert, amazingly cared for by his son Paul, and for that, Paul, the whole state is immensely grateful. He served between 39 and 45 in the Signals Detachment of the 2nd, 3rd Anti-Aircraft Regiment, reached the rank of Sergeant, and he served in Morotai, North Borneo, and we thank you for all the service you've rendered to our nation in peace and war, Colin.
And we'll be hearing from Colin a bit later and hearing more about his story. It is absolutely extraordinary, so stay tuned because we will be bringing you that soon. we can see 1027 Battalion, principally based at Keswick and Warradale. A number of country depots too across South Australia and also Broken Hill.
It's an Army Reserve Battalion, but it comprises infantry with combat engineers from 3 Field Squadron under command. It has this unit has a history, can trace its history back to all South Australian infantry units, even in the colonial militia, the CMF and the Army Reserve, and even as far back as pre-Federation forces in South Australia. The Boer War. Yep.
So this is the 9th Combat Service Support Battalion. And the battalion's recently undergone a pretty significant change, so integrating both a full and part-time workforce, and now located across 2 separate bases in Adelaide. So some at Warradale and the others at Edinburgh as well.
Most recently, the battalion's been involved in heavily in supporting domestic operations, including Operation Bushfire Assist, Operation COVID Assist and Operation Flood Assist. And hard work doing your normal military training and then doing that work as well, that they do impact one another. 1446 Squadron coming up. Leading that squadron and the officer commanding is Major Deborah Elmy, along with Squadron Sergeant Major Warrant Officer Class 2 Bill Peterson.
Located at Keswick Barracks, but initially raised at Beulah Park in 1966.
And it's an integrated regular and reserve unit and provides essential communication support to 9 Brigade.
th Regiment here.
Yep.
Formed in South Australia in 1969, based at Woodside. And leading the regiment is its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Floyd, along with Regimental Sergeant Major Warrant Officer Class 1 Scott Shivers.
The white lanyard of the artillery. The colour patch on the puggaree, the band around the slouch hat tells you that they're artillery, as does the white lanyard on their right shoulder. Tell an awful lot about a soldier just by looking at him from a distance. 613 Light Battery Royal Australian Artillery, and leading today is the officer commanding Major Thomas Radford with Squadron Sergeant Major Warrant Officer Class 2 Elton George. This unit was formed recently in 2013 with the merger of 16 and 48 field batteries based in Tasmania and South Australia respectively. It has 3 joint fire teams and is equipped with 81mm mortar. My son-in-law, Geordie Mulhall, is in this unit.
Now we have 3rd Health Battalion, and leading this battalion is its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Butt, along with Regimental Sergeant Major Warrant Officer Class 1 Georgia Jones. So headquartered at Keswick Barracks, but there are other elements in Melbourne, Hobart and in Sydney, primarily an Army Reserve unit. Next up, we have the RAAF City of Adelaide Squadron, the 24th Squadron. And leading there is Commanding Officer Wing Commander Craig Keane, along with Squadron Warrant Officer Gavin Jones.
This unit was formed in 1940 and saw action in the Pacific Theatre against the Japanese and undertaking operations during the Battle of Rabaul and in the New Guinea, New Britain and Borneo campaigns, and became a Citizen Air Force squadron in Malala at 9F-51 flying Mustangs. My father was a pilot with this unit, flew Mustangs during that period. Later it became a non-flying squadron and relocated to the RAAF Edinburgh to support flying units at that base.
Speaking of RAAF Edinburgh right there.
Yeah, the security dogs. Leading that contingent is the commanding officer of Night Squadron RAAF Wing Commander Lawrence Benninger, the Squadron Warrant Officer Andrew Gibbons. Its main tenet is 92 Wing, which through number 11 Squadron operates these new Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. They also have the MQ-4C Trident unmanned surveillance aircraft.
Okay, so now we've moved on to our next group, which is representative of the Adelaide Nation, starting with the Royal Navy. So this is the longest associated force in Australian history, dating back to Sydney Cove in 1788. And next up, the British Army. So this includes all members of the British Army not marching in other units.
Behind the British Army, the British Airborne Forces. Yes, the British Airborne Brotherhood of South Australia. This consists of World War II veterans who took part in airborne operations in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Arnhem and the Rhine crossing, and includes the Normandy assault, Colditz Castle and Dunkirk veterans.
And you can see their distinctive red berets as well.
And down behind them, the City of Elizabeth Pipe Band. So the numbers vary, Bill. We know that with the veterans in terms of whether they come out. So is today the perfect day? Like it's not too warm. It's not that sunny. You get a bit of relief if you're one of the older veterans. So is this just about perfect?
Yeah, I reckon nearly spot on. It is. It's just about perfect. The weather is not going to play a big part. That's what you like. It's not too hot, not too cold. We'll just get through it. I think for the older veterans, it's being able to do the distance. Yeah, that's some of them come out and practice for weeks. Some of them have even gone and had knee replacements, so they can time the knee replacement to be May, June, so they can be right for the next year.
So we just saw the Royal Air Force buoy entrance before. Now we move on to Greece. And you can see the escorts there in traditional Greek national dress. And this association was founded in Adelaide by Greek migrants. Behind Greece, we have Poland. And there's a special link between Polish veterans and Australians. So the Free Polish Army units, they were part of the British force that relieved the 9th Australian Division at the Siege of Tobruk during 1941.
Some of those Australians who are in Tobruk, I think they were some of them that were brought back to Australia and then repurposed to go and fight in Papua New Guinea and places like that.
A lot of the units did that.
So they're fighting in the desert in the heat and then come back to fight in the jungle.
That's right.
So now we're on to our next group, which is the descendants. So this is where we're seeing a replication of what we saw at the start of the march. So the people you were seeing here are marching with their medals on their right. So this is because they are marching with the medals that were awarded to their loved ones, to their ancestors, to their next of kin. So they are marching in their honour, and we remember all those who are no longer with us and able to march.
I can see you down there with the headband on. The red headband is John Lakoviak. He's an elder Aboriginal statesman in the South Australian community. John's great-grandfather was Arthur Thomas Walker, who was killed on the 16th of August 1916 in Mookie Farm. He's there with his son Jackson, and he died, has no known grave, which is very sad, particularly for a member of the Aboriginal community.
Bill, let's for those people who don't know, the way that the RSL in South Australia has decided to run the march is to have this replica, if you like. So you've got only people who have served, essentially is who we've seen veterans marching so far, either those serving or have served.
Yeah.
And now we get the descendants. So why don't they all march together?
Well, it became very problematic about 10 years ago when, in good faith, a lot of the families wanted to join the units, and you might find that a unit with 3 or 4 ageing World War II veterans was surrounded by 10 to 15 to 20 family of other veterans. It was very difficult for the public to recognise the veterans that had served in among all the families of other veterans. So it was decided to show the veterans who had actually served the respect of letting them march alone or with a carer, and asking the descendants who wanted to remember a loved one to march in a different part of the march independently where they could. There's Peter Collins. His dad was a veteran of Tobruk there in behind that 2nd 10th Battalion flag banner. I might take the opportunity of mentioning some World War II veterans that were prominent marchers, well-known marchers who subsequently have died in recent years, but were here up until, in one case last year. We've got Air Ace Bob Cowper of 456 Squadron, Doug Hoyle from 452 Squadron, Doug Leake 149 Squadron, David Lester, Pathfinder pilot of 35 Squadron, and Norm Ginn, Jack Treadway, Merv Fox of Z Special Unit, Ed Ebsbury, the 2nd 27th Battalion, Clive Whitrow, Les Brown and Ron Bridgman, Ron died this year. He was the last member of the 27th Battalion SA Scottish Regiment. Murray Willing, Bob Masterson, Harold Wheels and Bill Schmidt, Bluey Stevens, Ron Gratz and their mates from the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion. Now, some of their family are marching in these units in front of us in memory of the veterans that have gone. So this is all about memories and respect and acknowledging the service.
Bill, just take us through. So we're seeing a lot of signs here. We saw earlier in the march there were some signs, but there wasn't anyone marching behind. So what happens with that each year? What's the decision made about?
Well, each year, and if you look at it, there was only 2 army units. There was the 108 Tank Attack Regiment, and but I didn't actually, that flipped past so fast we didn't see it in the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion. When a unit has no more marches, the organisers, the Anzac Day Committee, give it one more year, and then if no one comes forward, the unit is retired. It's not out of the march, it just goes into a different part of the march, a little bit further back. So so the units at the front provide a venue for the original veterans to march, and as they're slowly retired, the front of the march will contract, as you're seeing now, and if the family so wish, they can join in a separate part of the march a little bit further back. So the march, in a sense, becomes quite a little bit bigger at the rear and a bit smaller at the front.
Well, that'll evolve over time too, I suppose. We'll get more of a current day guys who are serving now, that they will march on in the future, hopefully.
Hopefully they will. So we've still got, there's lots of generations. Some of our conflicts only just recently concluded. So we hope that those young men and women will choose to participate in the march. It's one way of acknowledging the service of their comrades, but it also allows the people of South Australia to acknowledge their own individual service. And I think it's nice for them to get that recognition.
I agree, and I think over the years we've spoken to so many veterans, and so many are young and feel like they haven't earned the right to take part in this march, in these commemorations, and then finally they do, and I think it's as you said, Bill, it's really worthwhile for everyone to thank them for their service and for them to get the recognition that they deserve, because they are signing a blank cheque. as they take part.
They do. Everybody deserves recognition. Whether they actually go overseas and see active service is always just a moot point. It's the product of what the posting officer decides in Canberra. But everybody that actually puts their name on the dotted line, they're all saying, I am prepared to go. I will go overseas and defend this country with my life if you want me to. Whether they're asked to go or not is a separate issue, but everybody deserves that respect because they're all up for it.
There are people who feel like they didn't serve because they didn't get to go overseas. There was a period of time when a whole, for 10 years or so, where nobody was serving overseas.
That's right. Call that the Great Peace, and that was broken with the operation in Bougainville. But yes, there were some of our finest officers served and soldiers served in the Great Peace, and just didn't deploy. But doesn't mean their service is any less valuable. And I know a lot of people that didn't go overseas feel that, and it's sad.
And we do need to mention as well that it's not just deployments overseas, but it's the work that so many of them do at home. And what we've seen with natural disasters, particularly over the past few months, we saw the flooding in Queensland, and the Defence Force was called in to help. Yep. The work that they do, the moment the Defence Force rocks up, communities just breathe a sigh of relief because they know they're in safe hands. They know they'll be looked after and they'll be cared for, and that the work will be done to try and get them all back on their feet. So the work is immense, and they deserve every recognition imaginable.
Absolutely. Give a shout out to Brian Ellis. I didn't see Fair Miles go past. I think the units were fairly close together at the beginning of the march, and we missed Fair Miles, but Brian Ellis was on the Fair Miles, which was a wooden hull ship of the Royal Australian Navy, not much bigger than Sydney Harbour ferries. Harvey Brown also, who served with 108 Tank Attack Regiment. Harvey was there earlier on, I think, with his son Steve and granddaughter Rebecca and great-granddaughter Cara. They whipped through, and Harvey served in Morotai and in Ambon. 4 generations were on parade. So that's a wonderful effort, all involved.
Bill, just again, if you are a returned veteran, if you are serving, if you are a relative, there is a place for you on the march.
There is, and yes, you either participate as a veteran who's returned, as a veteran who didn't go overseas but still served his or her nation, or whether you're a family member who just wants to acknowledge the service of a loved one. And as we said earlier in the march, Neil, pretty well every Australian, if they look far enough into their own family history, will find someone that served. We saw that today with the Governor's Deputy, who's on the reviewing the parade, his family.
So you are watching the march, which is the second part of Anzac Day commemorations. So it's a 3-part commemoration, a trilogy. We had the dawn service, which symbolises the funeral service. This is the march, which symbolises the march to the gravesite or the cortege. That will be followed by the Cross of Sacrifice service, which signifies the burial. Now, right now coming up, you can see the next generation. Australian Navy cadets are a bit beyond this group here. We also have the Vietnamese community in Australia.
This is a marvellous display. First time I've seen that. On the 30th of April will be the fall of Saigon. That's a big day in the Vietnamese community. It's only on Saturday we're commemorating that. And these are Australian citizens, people that have come from Vietnam and their children. Most of them, as I said previously, have come out as refugees after escaping after the fall of Saigon, and they've made Australia their new home, and marvellous job.
And coming up, you can see the Navy cadets. So teenagers, young men and women aged between 13 and 19 years. So they learn skills associated with citizenship, leadership and seamanship. And all our cadets take part in catafalque party duties at dawn services right throughout the metropolitan area on Anzac Day. And also, of course, they carry all the banners that we've been seeing, unit identification plates, right throughout the march.
The fact that cadets are coming through now means we're getting towards the end of the march.
It's been a very quick march this year. Be slightly shorter than last year, I think.
So, as we mentioned, the third part of this trilogy is the service at the Cross of Sacrifice. Stay with us, we will have coverage of that as well. So, we've got the Enfield Brass and Harndorf Town bands coming through after the Air Force cadets. And then we get to the Anzac Day marshals, and this day doesn't happen without these marshals.
It doesn't happen without them, does it? They've done a marvellous job. Some of them have been doing this job for 30 years.
So there are about 120 marshals, and incredibly, 1,400 volunteers carry signs, drive vehicles, provide music and support for the march.
We're very lucky in South Australia. The march is pretty well run by the RSL, Ian Smith and his committee. There's Tony Chaplin, the Chief Marshal. Tony's been doing this for many, many years and does a great job. That's the team that pull it all together.
In terms of our coverage, he's the one who says, we're going to finish at this time.
Yeah, that's right. So you guys can get across to where you need to be.
Yes, and after this we'll be going to the services, the dawn service at Gallipoli, now on to the services at Villa Bretonneau.
Yeah.
Finally, to signal the end of the march to the Barossa Light Horse Historical Association. See them there coming through, established in 1984, depicting the first AIF light horse from 1914 to 1918.
There were more than 40,000 horsemen in the original light horse. Can you believe it?
Amazing.
Clip-clop down city streets. Usually that's only the police greys you see at night in Hindley Street, Emma, when you're there. Is that right?
And that brings us to the end of the match.
Certainly does, and you can see them just go past Adelaide Oval there. Well, soon we will be taking you to the Cross of Sacrifice for the third part of our Anzac Day commemorations. So at the start of the coverage, we mentioned some significant dates. This year also marks the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings. So the D-Day landings were on June 6th, 1944, and were a pivotal moment in World War II. Codenamed Operation Overlord, Allied forces, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, executed a meticulously planned invasion on the beach of Normandy, France. This massive assault involved airborne and amphibious landings on 5 beachheads: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword. Despite heavy casualties, the Allies successfully established a crucial foothold, ultimately leading to the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation. The D-Day landings remain a symbol of courage and of sacrifice. So we saw him at the beginning of the march and marching proudly as well, as he always does. Right now, well, he's possibly enjoying a game of two-up at the moment. He's soon to be 102. Reg Swanborough just could not wait to enlist in the Royal Navy. He served in the Arctic convoys, another vital part of the World War II campaign.
Reg Swanborough joined the British Royal Navy in 1938 at the end of the Great Depression. He was 15 years old.
I conned my mother into signing papers for me, ran away to sea. and joined the Navy, and I was in England, that was. Education was a pretty non-starter in those days unless you were rich, you know. I wanted to go into communications, and my education at that time was not good enough, and so I went to school and studied at night instead of playing footy. And after 11 weeks I went up a couple of grades and I managed to get into communications, which saved my life, because the other 32 boys or 32 boys that joined with me, all about the same age, they got split up into 3 ships. They went to sea because their course was a lot shorter. So they went to sea, and they all died.
Reg was sent into battle at 18 years of age as part of the Arctic convoys. From 1941 to 1945, Royal Navy escorts and merchant ships delivered essential supplies to the Soviet Union.
Well, I went to that ship there in Manchester. She was in Portsmouth when I joined her, and I think the first night we were there we got bombed, and it was just immediately after Dunkirk, you see. And I remember the bloody Germans, they came over to bomb us there, you see. What they didn't know is the Brits had just invented radar, but it wasn't called radar, it was called radio direction finding, you see. And we had 2 ships there, none of us knew. We didn't know. 2 of our ships there had just been fitted with it. 2 big cruisers. And I remember the Germans coming over, and they didn't know we had radar, and we had detected them 60 miles out. It doesn't sound much, does it? But planes in those days only flew at about 140 miles an hour, you know. So we had a bit of warning. We were all closed up to action station, all guns manned. And there were a lot of ships there. I mean, I don't know, probably a couple of dozen ships there. All guns loaded, told not to fire until given the order, you see. And they all came over freely, and we let fire with everything, you know. Sky was full of shells and bullets and God knows what. I saw 2 of them come down, but I didn't see any more than that. And they all dropped their bombs and just skedaddled, you know. I mean, I remember getting sent up the top of the mast on that ship in the Mediterranean in battle with bloody shells screaming around us. And there was a kid on the flag deck with me. He was a conscript, and he panicked and he let go. And of course, in the wind generated by the speed we were doing, the flag goes to the top of the mast, just right on the outer yard arm. It's right out. And me, being a boy who'd done mast climbing part of my training, you see, Swanborough, get that flag. So I had to go up the bloody mast and out on the yard arm. You're on a bit of a wire. That's all you've got. You've got a wire underneath the yard arm. It's secured in 2 places. You've got to walk out on this wire and hold on to another one that runs along the top of the yard arm. You've got to hold on for dear life. Mind you, we're doing about 60 miles an hour, you know, or whatever, you know. And I've got to get that flag in from out here, and I've got to haul it in here, clip it onto this one, and all the time this bloody shells go.
The Arctic convoys were described by Winston Churchill as the most dangerous journey in the world.
And I saw this plane coming in. I saw him drop 2 torpedoes, and I remember yelling out to the bridge, "Torpedoes drop port side, sir," you know. Well, the first one missed us, and the second one blew me up in the bloody air. Didn't hit by me, but probably 30 metres, no more than that, away. Blew a hole in the ship's side big enough to put 2 double-deck buses through, you know. And, yeah. And we got back to Gibraltar after about 10 days. I think it took 10 days to get back, about that. We didn't sink. We had a lot of killed, a lot of men dead, you know. Flooded, you see. You imagine holding a ship's side that big. Imagine how much the volume of water that goes in. You see the whole engine space, or one of the engine spaces, was full of water. You see, the other one was still functioning. So that's how we got back.
In 1945, Reg moved to Australia and later joined the Royal Australian Navy.
I was out here in the Pacific when the war ended. I think I was in Japan, and we got a signal offering. This is just after the war ended, you know. Got the chance to purchase my discharge, that's buy out my contract. And I was a petty officer then, and I thought, yeah, that'll do me. So I said, yeah, provided I can be discharged in Australia, I'll take it, see. And I had a mate who'd married a girl from Williamstown up here, and he'd been telling me all about South Australia, and I came here, I had no other reason to come here, you know. Been here ever since.
In 2013, Reg was awarded the Arctic Star for his service during World War II. Now, 101, he has this advice.
Well, just try to live your life, try to be positive, try to be happy, you know. It's you know, we all have hard times, you know. You can't always be like it, but just try, you know. I find you know, you enjoy life better when you're happy, you know.
What an incredible man. Well, speaking of incredible men, Angus Hughes enlisted in October 1941. He was 18. Angus trained in Australia as an observer and was posted to the United Kingdom, where he served as a navigator and bomb aimer. Angus flew 32 missions with 467 Bomber Command.
We sat in the nose of the Lancaster. Anything we could see, I'd notify or tell the navigator. Well, when we were flying, the pilot said to me afterwards, when we were at the targets, I was the bomb aimer. And I was looking down all the time. He said, I never, ever doubted you, and you always seem to be so fresh. But he said, I noticed afterwards, once you got back at the briefing and you had a cup of tea, your hands were shaking like anything. And we were eventually shot down in September 26th. And we were just flying around, and out of the blue, there was a bang. And it hit our port outer engine. So we just had to bail out. Well, I was in the nose. My job was to take out the safety thing, what we used to lie on, and that was the way out. Put on our chutes. I went through, and then the engineer went through, the skipper went out through the top, and the others went out through the back door of the leg. Apparently they got caught immediately. I happened to get down to the Rhine at a place called, and I was caught at a place called Rastatt. There was a lot of canals there. I swam through one. I was wet through when I was walking along the road. I got caught by a German soldier. And then I spent a month in a jail. And eventually I was transferred up to the interrogation place at Frankfurt. After going through that, I was then transferred across to Bankhouse. That was close to the Polish border. We were there until January, and then we had to, on a forced march in the middle of winter, cold as anything. We went to a place called Luckenwald. That was south of Berlin. That took about 23 days to walk through the snow and the ice and at night they'd find a barn for us with the cows and all that. We'd sleep on the straw. There were 1,700, I think, of us, and roughly 400 got either died or got shot. In April We got liberated by the Russians, but they kept us there until June. The British came through to pick us up and the Russians wouldn't let us go. Once we were liberated, I went down to their record room. There was me and another chap, and we fossiled through and we got our own records from the Germans, which are these. So that's part of my history. This knife here, that was the knife I used in Germany, which was given to us to eat with, and the only reason I've kept it, it's got a swastika on it. So that proves that it is a knife that I use. The service life is a very good life, and especially in the RAF too, even though it was hard and that we had a lot of fun. It was quite. I'm not sorry I was there really now, but it's hard to believe that 80 years ago I was actually doing this.
Well, while thousands of veterans have taken part in Anzac Day marches, both here in Adelaide and right across the country today, there are others who choose not to be part of these commemorations. One of the country's oldest living World War II veterans, 106-year-old Colin Wagner, is one of those who has never marched. Bethany Alderson travelled to the Adelaide Hills to speak to him.
In 1938, at just 20 years of age, Colin Wagner joined the army with his three best friends.
I knew a war was coming and I thought we went in it before they came and got us, sort of thing.
He would be the only one of the foursome to return home. During his service, Mr. Wagner worked his way up the ranks to sergeant, a promotion that took him on an unexpected journey.
It was very, very secret where we were going. And we finished up in a convoy heading for Borneo.
As a keen photographer, Mr. Wagner knew he had to capture the moment of history. He traded rationed cigarettes for darkroom equipment to develop film at night. Those photos would later feature at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra.
That's the front line, and just there.
He returned home at the end of the war in 1945, eventually boarding a train to Adelaide.
It was Christmas, 10:30, Christmas morning, 1945, when a train pulled at Adelaide railway station and I was on it. My father picked me up and brought me home. It was a wonderful feeling to walk up to my front door knowing I'd never have to go away again.
The now 106-year-old describes Anzac Day as his holy day, but the veteran has never chosen to march.
I respect it all, and I do what I have to do, but it's not my thing.
Mr. Wagner considers the years after the end of the war as his bonus years and attributes his longevity to living an active lifestyle.
I think with health, I'm just lucky.
And so he marches on in his bonus years. He'll be 107 in December.
Absolutely incredible. Well, women have played a significant part in Australia's military history, from nurses in the Boer War to the Women's Auxiliary Forces in World War II and to the front lines of today. This project by Carla Edwards pays tribute to Australia's military women.
I'm a photojournalist, and this project is my personal thank you to the women of Australia who have served in the military. This project involves making a woman's portrait, an ex-service woman's portrait, and recording their story. Are you able to stand up for me? And I want you to stand in this space. Can you fold one arm and point towards me? Nice. Okay. Oh, yeah, point up to the sky. I hope the audience realised that it wasn't only the men.
I actually enlisted when I was 17 and a half, but they wouldn't let me go in. So I got my call up 2 days after my 18th birthday. I was sent to Newcastle as a gunner. A lot of people have said to me, I didn't know women did anything during the war.
Oh, that's a nice one. We go through and pick all your fives, and then we go again and have a look and see which one you're most happy with. I like that one because that's a look up.
I was the first one she took the photo of, and sort of skyrocketed all from there.
We've had a small exhibition at Woy Woy on the Central Coast, which really kicked this project off.
It was a great honour when Carla asked me to be part of it, and I said, yes, I'll run with it, and helped her round up some women.
I think it's great recognition. It's recognition of my nan, who's 101, and it's something to remind us when she's not here.
And it doesn't matter what service you're in, a woman can do anything, if not better than the man.
Second to that has been 24 New South Wales women at Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park, Sydney.
I think I never realised how in the background women's service was till Carla sort of reached out.
The most significant thing about this project is it's never been done before. It's the biggest database of women's stories, portraits and audio interview that's available across the country.
We know a lot about men in the military, in the headlines, but we very rarely hear women's stories.
Yes, I was walking on the perimeter of Fort Wallace. I heard an explosion and then some blood dripping from my forehead. They x-rayed it and the doctor came out and said, "You've got a bullet in your head."
This way, that's it. Keep turning. You want her jacket? Not yet.
I was at the ripe old age of 18. It was my birthday. I just said I want to join, and there it was. As simple as that.
To embark upon what is now a long-running project is just wonderful, and I'm in awe and honoured every time I meet a new woman to photograph and interview.
They're so inspiring. I mean, women over 100 being involved in the project and just hearing their stories and their roles. I believe that women in defence should be seen to be as important as men in defence.
I think that the women of this country were absolutely outstanding in their service.
I still have another 50 people on the wait list across Australia to do. I would say my job is done, but it's not done. It's only the beginning.
Indeed, it's only the beginning. We look forward to all those women who are serving the military and continue to serve our country. Now, this is the view of Pennington Gardens and the Cross of Sacrifice ceremony, which will start soon. But we're just waiting for the Governor to arrive. In fact, there you go. The Governor, the Governor's Deputy, His Excellency, is just arriving now, Dr. Richard Harris. And he will come through in a moment. Bill, talking of women and sacrifice and how this Cross of Sacrifice was actually set up.
Yes, Neil, this is the Women's War Memorial Cross of Sacrifice, which reinforces once again the role of women in the whole war concept. We've heard about We know the ones that serve, but there are others that serve behind the scenes that don't get the recognition that they are due, and they are the war widows and the partners of veterans. And think about it, you know, your husband or partner may decide to enlist you, not even in favour of it. Off he goes, you're left to run the family on your own. You worry about him every night. You have no idea if he's going to come back. When he comes back, he's damaged one way or the other. He's either physically damaged or mentally damaged, and then you have to care for him. And in a lot of cases, he dies prematurely, and you're left a widow. It has a huge impact on women, and the work they do under the radar is amazing. I had a very dear friend died only last week, or 2 weeks ago, Diana Osmond, and she had already lost her brother in World War II. She got married in 1950, and her husband, a war veteran, died of war-related causes a year later, and she was for 70 years a war veteran. Come to this march every year and watch. You know, I implore people to take note of the lot of the war widow and the partner of veterans, and realise what an important part they play in the whole tapestry of service life and service to the nation. And on the 19th of October this year will be our first National War Widows Day. Other states have had it. We in South Australia had it started last year, but this year on the 19th of October will be the first National War Widows Day.
You saw earlier some vision from the 60s of an Anzac Day commemoration. Traditionally, so this is where the service of remembrance is held at the Cross of Sacrifice here at North Adelaide at Pennington Gardens as soon as the Anzac Day March finishes. So this is signifying a finale. As we mentioned, the trilogy of commemorations. We have the dawn service, which is the funeral service, the march, which symbolises the march to the burial site, and the Cross of Sacrifice signifies the burial.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the mounting of the catafalque party. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Well, firstly, good morning to each and every one of you. My name is Mick Barrett and I'm the chaplain from HMAS Encounter, and it is my honour to share this significant morning and space with each and every one of you today. Today's service of remembrance is something that is actually quite unique to our state here in South Australia. Officially opened in 1922, these gardens were developed and funded by women, for women, and especially for the widows seeking to honour the sacrifice of their men who died in the Great War. Known as the Garden of Memory, with the Cross of Sacrifice at one end and the Stone of Remembrance at the other, these gardens have now become a place of peace and reflection for all generations, for women and for men, for young and for old, who come here to remember and honour those who have served this nation with the ultimate sacrifice. Not only do we gather today in the shadow of St. Peter's impressive cathedral, but more significantly, we are also gathering in the shadow of Easter, a time of year that calls us to remember yet another great sacrifice in history, which has shaped the world we live in and the way we think about that word sacrifice today. And that is the sacrifice which occurred on a cross many years ago of a man named Jesus. Our memorial today reflects the story of Jesus. Why? Because it also is in the shape of a cross, as are these very gardens that we sit in today. And if you were able to go up into the sky on a plane or a hot air balloon or whatever it may be and look down from above, you would also see that the cathedral itself is also in the shape of a cross. And all of these symbols, they point us to that moving sacrificial story of Jesus. And also those who gave their lives in service of our nation. Now, as we continue to collectively together remember and reflect on the image and on the meaning of the cross, and on the courage and sacrifices which have been made by those who came before us. Now let us stand together for the hymn, O Valiant Hearts. Please stand. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Let us pause now for a prayer of remembrance. God of hope and light, today we bring our utmost thanks for the peace and the security that we know in our land. But as we acknowledge the blessings of freedom, peace and security that we know here in Australia today, we also ask for a healing of memories and forgiveness for misdeeds in war. Bring us all to the day when nations no longer make war against other nations. Today we also remember the physically wounded and the mentally scarred. We pray for healing and peace for body, mind and spirit. We remember those who died in battle or from their wounds, and those who took their own lives in agony or despair. God, we ask that you embrace them and comfort their families who remain. We remember the homes, livelihoods, and communities destroyed by bombs and gunfire. God, have mercy on all who still live in the shadow of war today. We remember the parents, spouses, siblings, children, and sweethearts who prayed and grieved for the missing and for the lost. God, we pray for comfort of those who still mourn. Today, as we remember the terrible cost of this and every other war, renew in us the longing for peace and the will to work for it day by day and side by side. These things we bring before you today. Amen. The hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save, is an appropriate song for today. This hymn was inspired by ancient writings and has been a constant melody in the Navy for generations, provoking hope and faith from within the darkness and chaos of stormy seas. It reminds us that no matter how dark and chaotic life can be, even from within the sufferings and the cries of war, that God still remains. He's still close, he still comforts, and he's still present. So please, let us stand together and sing Eternal Father, Strong to Save.
It's
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. In a moment, we will have the laying of 3 wreaths, followed by the ode, the last post, a minute's silence, and reveille. But before we do this, and to help us grasp the significance of what will now take place, please allow me to share a brief word of explanation. A memorial such as this, it represents our fallen. Memorials are made to symbolise before us the bodies of those who may be lost or buried in faraway lands. And then we have our wreaths, which have been used as symbols since ancient times to honour acts of courage and acts of bravery, and also for those who grieve and mourn the lost. And when we see our catafalque party, again in ancient times, a deceased body that was waiting for burial might be laid on a large stone, a catafalque, and the body would then be guarded by the soldiers. This is why we have a catafalque party with arms, surrounding and respectfully guarding and protecting our fallen. Traditionally, if you were to stay in barracks or other military installations, you would be woken each morning by the trumpet playing of Rouse, or in the Royal Australian Navy, reveille. And then, later on in the evening, you would then be sent to sleep at night with the last post. But here today, something different happens. These 2 traditions are reversed. Today, in this sacred space, the last post is heard first, signifying that our fallen have now gone to sleep in death. And the minute's silence that follows is to respectfully let them do so, not to awaken them. The flag then goes to half-mast, which symbolises our grief and our sadness. But then that silence is broken by reveille, a French word, a call to wake up. And so the flag then returns to full mast, which expresses the Easter hope, which is a promise and comfort that death is not the end of the story. With that, I would now like to invite His Excellency, Dr. Richard Harris, to come forward and lay the first wreath. I would now like to invite the representatives for Legacy Youth, Oscar and Nathaniel Kemp, to please come forward and lay their wreath. And finally, I would like to invite the representative of the Australian War Widows, Jan Millen, to please come forward to lay their wreath. We now come to the reciting of the Ode of Remembrance from Lawrence Binyon's poem, For the Fallen. We are honoured today that this will be recited for us by Mrs. Julie Broome, who is a war widow, who I would like to invite up now for the reading. As Mrs. Broome makes her way up, I would also like to invite everyone to stand now for the Ode of Remembrance, and afterwards to also remain standing for the last post, the minute's silence and reveille, which is to follow. Thank you, Mrs. Broome.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
We have gathered today in remembrance of the men and women who have served this nation with courage and with integrity, many at the cost of their own lives. Each one has set an example for us to follow. As the armistice that ended the Great War was signed by the representatives of France, Britain and Germany, it seems only fitting that our benediction for today hails from the lands of Europe. So I leave you with these words from the ancient Celtic tradition. As we go out today, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain upstanding for the playing of the national anthems of Australia and New Zealand.
Cross of Sacrifice. Might have missed the first bit there. That's our Cross of Sacrifice coverage, which completes the trilogy of coverage of the services in Adelaide today. The dawn service, followed by the march, of course, and now the Cross of Sacrifice. And soon we'll be heading live to the services in Europe, at Gallipoli firstly, and then at Villers-Bretonneux in France. But right now, we're going to have a look at some of the pictures of previous Anzac Day commemorations, and it's from the Many Days of Anzac documentary. This is the story of the beginnings of Anzac commemorations in Australia.
A coffin is carried from Melbourne's St Paul's Cathedral and placed on a gun carriage. This is the first major commemoration of Anzac on Australian soil. It's the funeral of a single soldier. Major General William Throsby Bridges, commander of the Australian Imperial Force at Gallipoli, is being laid to rest. Shot by a sniper while visiting the front line, the General's body has been returned to Melbourne from the Middle East in a lead-lined coffin.
The streets of Melbourne are lined with people who are grieving. It's described as a sea of black. Women are wearing mourning black to signify the loss of their own sons.
The General's remains are taken to Spencer Street Station and then transported to Canberra by train for burial.
There are stories of communities coming out of Benalla, at Albury, greeting the train, which is a simple carriage clad with black crepe, offering their respects, grieving, playing funeral marches, creating a hymn around this soldier, this dead soldier, because he's one of ours who is coming home and he represents the grief of the nation.
General Bridges is finally buried on a hill overlooking the Royal Military College Duntroon, where he'd been the first commandant. He's the only Australian soldier honoured with a home burial during the war, as government policy normally forbids the return of bodies from war zones. This means the General's funeral is a surrogate ceremony for all the nation's bereaved families. Just a month after Melbourne's outpouring of grief, Adelaide hosts the first Anzac Day known by that name. But it's far from a solemn occasion. The organisers of a carnival to celebrate the 8-hour day simply repurpose it as Anzac Day to raise money for the war effort and encourage enlistment.
Volunteers marched, horses with empty saddles marched, women in particular went alongside the marchers, raising funds, rattling tins and selling flowers.
It was all about spectacle. It wasn't a day of mourning. You had the staging of crashes of tram cars, you had people dressed up as prehistoric dinosaurs. It was spectacle, it was celebratory.
While Adelaide celebrates, back at Gallipoli the fighting grinds on. Many of the first commemorations of Anzacs occur on the battlefield itself. They're conducted by comrades of the dead.
They wanted to give men a decent burial, and the Padres worked very hard to make sure that that happened, usually at night, you know, under cover of darkness, burying men when they could. And their mates wanted to know that they'd been buried well, and I'm sure their families did too.
The Anzacs' makeshift graves are marked by wooden crosses, made from empty ammunition boxes.
They'd also take the tins that carried water across the peninsula. They'd beat that tin and they'd inscribe, quite lovingly, an inscription for that man. So you imagine the labour of that, etching that man's name, the date of his death, and perhaps a message there.
When the Anzacs finally withdraw, the dead fill the thoughts of the living.
You read accounts of men saying, you know, I hope they don't hear us as we're marching down the gullies to leave. And one of the Padres sprinkled wattle seeds, you know, so he'd leave a bit of Australia on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the graves.
The Anzacs may have passed their test, but now their families are counting the cost.
You actually have these private memorials that are set up in homes, on mantelpieces. The rooms of the men themselves become a kind of shrine. They're actually very fragile assemblies of the pictures of men, the medals of men, the artefacts that are brought home. could be a comb, it could be a Bible, something that carries a sense of that man. These become the focal point of a kind of shrine that families construct around the memory of that lost individual.
If we count as a family a person's parents, children, siblings, aunts and uncles and cousins, then every second Australian family is bereaved by the war. Its impact rolls through the towns and suburbs of Australia like a great wave of grief.
Yes, that great wave of grief. And Bill, it's important to keep in touch. It's a fragile history, the Anzac history, isn't it? And you yourself, some of the people that you've been speaking about today and just others that have passed by, there are just so many Anzacs out there.
There are, and we talked about how we retire units from the march, Neil, and when we think there are no more marches, and I have to say, and I send a cheerio to, one unit's been retired, but we have found that there is a surviving member, and it may not mean the unit can march again, because he can't march, but he will always be remembered, and that's Dudley Roberts in Kangaroo Island, a former member of the 2nd 27th Battalion, saw service in Balikpapan and New Guinea, and was a soldier settler on Kangaroo Island. So Dudley, this will be the first time you've mentioned. Have a happy day. And I guess that leads into the most important aspect of history.
Well, that's right, and it is so important to continue to remember so many of our men and women who have served, and there are many different ways of doing that, aren't there, Bill?
There are, and one of them is through the Virtual War Memorial Australia, which is based here at Torrens Parade Ground. It's based on a wiki-style digital platform, and it allows people very, very simply to record the history of their ancestor. Now, anybody who watched this march on the ground or who watched it on television is watching it for a reason, and as we said earlier, nearly every Australian has a military link. This is the perfect place to record that. And as they say in there, it's not just something you might like to do, it's an obligation to your children and your grandchildren. So your history, or the history of a veteran in your family, can always be recorded. They've got 1.5 million records on there already, and it's South Australian based. It's nationally prominent, and I encourage every person with a military history to make sure they go to Virtual War Memorial Australia, and very simply, with all the help in the world, assistance they might need, they can make sure that mum, dad, grandpa, uncle, auntie service is recorded for posterity. So when the great-grandchildren say, what did grandpa do in the war? You can press a button and find out.
Well, that concludes our Anzac Day commemorations here in Adelaide as we honour and remember those who have served and are still serving in times of war, in times of conflict and in times of peace.
But stay with us on the ABC for live coverage of the Gallipoli dawn service from Turkey, followed by the commemorative service from Villers-Bretonneux in France. And of course, you can catch up on all of the coverage across Australia and overseas later today on iView. Neil Cross, Emma Rebellato, Bill Denny, thanks for joining us.